There were two areas of concern in America's relations with Spain. First, many in the West and South hoped to gain access to the Mississippi River, and particularly the port of New Orleans, which would allow access to much broader markets. Secondly, the proper boundary dividing Spanish Florida from American holdings in the southeast was disputed, as shown with this map on the right. Thomas Pinckney traveled to Spain to negotiate an agreement with the Spanish government. He returned with what many have called Pinckney's Treaty, but it's more properly known as the Treaty of San Lorenzo. The treaty granted the United States unrestricted, free access to the Mississippi and the port of New Orleans. Secondly, Spain recognized the 31st parallel as the boundary between Florida and American territory. This is the map shown earlier. The arrow points to the 31st parallel, which became the recognized border between the holdings of both the Americans and Spanish. Overall, Pinckney's Treaty was a tremendous accomplishment for the nation and quite popular in the United States. By the end of Washington's term in office, it was clear that differing views over the future of the American government were emerging in the form of two political parties. One group was named the Federalists. They were led by Alexander Hamilton and John Adams. While George Washington stayed above the partisan bickerings, he most often sided with the views of the Federalists. They were strongest in the Northeast, where they supported a strong national government and tended to have pro-business orientations. They adopted a loose interpretation of the Constitution and tended to be pro-British in foreign policy. The opposing group was named the Democratic Republicans, and they were most associated with the views of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. They were strongest in the South and West, where they supported states' rights and small farmers. They advocated a strict interpretation of the Constitution and tended to be pro-French in their foreign policy. As Washington was set to leave office, he offered some parting advice to the nation in his farewell address. Much of it included a condemnation of political parties as they posed a serious threat to the young nation. He also argued the country must avoid entangling alliances, particularly the war in Europe. Washington retired after 8 years in office, thereby establishing the precedent of a 2-term limit for American presidents, broken only by Franklin Roosevelt in the 20th century. With the retirement of Washington came the need for another presidential election. In a very close race, the winner turned out to be George Washington's vice president, John Adams. John Adams was an attorney from Massachusetts who was opposed to the Crown's policies in the years before the American Revolution. He later served in the Continental Congress and was part of the delegation which secured the involvement of the French in the fight against England. For 8 years prior to the election of 1796, he had served as Washington's vice president and was clearly aligned with the Federalist camp. Now, it was his turn. The leader of the Democratic Republicans, Thomas Jefferson, was Adams' primary opponent in the election. The results were quite surprising. Adams won the election with a majority of electoral votes. However, Jefferson finished second and was named vice president. This quirk in the Constitution would later be fixed with the 12th Amendment, but in the meantime, the nation was led by a president from one party and a vice president from another. Unfortunately for Adams, he was following the father of the nation, George Washington, into the presidency, and his administration was characterized by difficult times. The French were angered by Jay's Treaty, America's agreement with England. In retaliation, the French seized several American ships. Once again, American trading rights as neutrals were being threatened. To avoid war with France, Adams sent diplomats to Paris to reach a settlement. The French foreign minister refused to meet with the Americans. Then the delegation was approached by 3 individuals, later referred to as X, Y, and Z, who told the Americans they could meet with the French if they were paid a sum of $250,000. The Americans refused to pay what essentially was a bribe. This incident came to be known as the XYZ affair, as a wave of patriotism and anti-French sentiment spread across the country. A quasi-war began as there was fighting between the Americans and French in the Caribbean, yet no declaration of war. Democratic Republicans continued to sympathize with the French, so the Federalist-controlled Congress passed legislation to suppress opposition to the war against France. The Alien and Sedition Acts were actually a series of acts passed by Congress. 3 were aimed at foreigners who tended to support the Democratic-Republican Party. 1 allowed the president to expel any foreigner he considered to be dangerous to the nation, while another gave him the authority to jail or deport foreigners during wartime. A 3rd law extended the residency requirement for citizenship from 5 to 14 years. The Sedition Act was most controversial. It established limits on free speech by making it illegal to issue statements defaming or criticizing the president or the government. These were aimed at newspapers critical of the Federalists. Looking back today, they seem to violate the First Amendment, but the Federalists not only controlled Congress, but the judiciary as well. This cartoon satirizes the fierce debate in Congress. Federalists acted as if war at home was imminent. Jeffersonians were infuriated. For many, fears of a strong central government attacking the civil liberties of its citizens seemed to be coming true. State legislatures in Virginia and Kentucky responded by passing separate legal responses to what they believed were attacks on the freedoms of people living within their states. These were called the Virginia and Kentucky Resolutions. First, they argued the states had the right to judge the constitutionality of laws passed by Congress. Furthermore, if the national government exceeded its powers, states had the right to nullify any such laws. Initially, the authors of these resolutions were unclear. They feared prosecution under the Sedition Act. However, we now know they were written by James Madison, then a member of Congress, and Vice President Thomas Jefferson. Just think. President John Adams signed these bills into law, and his own vice president authored a major attack upon them.